After making my last video about things to do with OCs, I noticed a lot of enthusiasm around the crafts I included. And as someone who loves picking up 50 million different hobbies to support my OC addiction, I immediately began hunting down more things I could create for my OCs so that I could share them with you guys. So today I'm back with 3 more things you can make for any character you enjoy, whether that be OC or otherwise. But before I start, I wanted to say that this video did take a lot of time and money to create, so if you enjoy this video or want to see more, then definitely like, subscribe, or comment. It helps my channel in the algorithm and shows me that people want to see more of this type of content. I do want to note that these activities will be more difficult than my last crafts, increasing in difficulty throughout the video. However, I was able to learn all of these skills within a very short amount of time, so I truly believe these are something anyone can achieve. I'll also be including some alternate versions for some of these crafts for those who need it, so don't feel intimidated right at the start. But with that being said, I won't be covering things like sewing in depth in this video, so I figured it would be best to collaborate with Craftsy, the sponsor of today's video. Craftsy is a platform that hosts tons of creatives, each sharing their experience and technique with anyone looking to learn new skills. They have over 2,000 classes for you to explore in more than 20 creative categories, so it's incredibly easy to pick up new hobbies or refine ones you already have. As a small spoiler, 2 crafts in this video involve working with felt and sewing. Since I've never used felt before this point, I decided to check out the class Working with Felt by Ashley Howe. Not only did I get some valuable insight on the different types of felt, but I also learned how to blanket stitch, which is something I end up using later in this video. Craftsy also has classes for drawing and painting, so even if you aren't getting into sewing like me, it's definitely worth checking out for the wide range of artistic skills they do cover. If any of this sounds interesting or useful to you, you can scan the QR code on screen or visit the link in my description and pin comment to join today. What's even better is the first 1,000 people to use my link will get a full year of premium membership for only $1.49, which is valid for new members only. As a digital artist, I believe finding other artistic hobbies can really cure burnout while keeping those creative juices flowing, so I truly do encourage anyone to take advantage of this offer and start picking up new skills today. With that being said, let's get back into the video and see how these skills can be applied. After making my last craft video, I was still thinking about OC photo cards. If you watched the last one, I ended up making photo cards of mine and my girlfriend's OCs and still had some leftover photos from what I had printed. So it was perfect that I ended up encountering felt photo cards on TikTok. This felt like an elevated version of photo cards, and I loved how creative and detailed some of these could get. I've even seen people with photo card books that compile all of these into a single book, which I thought was amazing and something I wanted to do. So today I'll be showing my process for how I ended up making these. For this craft, you'll need a couple of materials. The most important thing is felt. I just ended up picking a variety of colors at Michael's since it's less than $1 per sheet, but I also picked up some various colored felt squares off AliExpress because of the wide range of colors they offered. I mostly use these as details because they're way too tiny to use for the frame, so I'd highly recommend just picking up some larger sheets at a craft store since they're accessible and super cheap. Next, I ended up getting some top loaders. Top loaders are usually used for trading cards, so you can find these at a lot of places that sell baseball or Pokemon cards. I'll be putting the photos in here, and their stiffness serves as a sturdy base for the felt to go on top of, because usually the felt you find in stores is pretty flimsy, so adding the top loader makes it have much more structural integrity. Other things you'll need are fabric scissors and glue, whether that be hot glue or fabric glue. I ended up using both since I had both on hand, but hot glue allows it to stick better. Fabric markers can also help when marking stuff out. I decided to stitch some of mine, so I used needle and thread for this project, but sewing isn't necessary at all, you can just glue it. And last, you'll need the photos themselves. You can visit my last OC video for the template and more specification on printing, but essentially I got mine printed at Office Depot on gloss cardstock paper. Of course, there's also extra stuff you can use, like these holographic card sleeves I put on my photos, and buttons or ribbons to further decorate your cards, but these aren't all necessary. But with that, let's get into the actual process. For all the ones I've made, I've looked on Pinterest and TikTok for inspiration. I'll be using this picture as inspiration for the one I'll be making today. I believe this was originally made by Joe Hay on Etsy, who does custom felt cards. So if you don't want to make these yourselves, then I'd recommend checking out their page. Their skill definitely seems to far exceed mine. I chose blue felt as my base and began with tracing the top loader on top of the felt. The felt will be surrounding the top loader, which is why I do this step. I make sure to leave some room on the side so I can glue or sew the front and back pieces together. After cutting out one side, I take that piece and trace it onto the felt so I have two identical sides. Then I use glue to place the top loader on top of one of the pieces of felt, centering it. With this stabilized, it's easy for me to put the other piece of felt on top of the other and see where I can cut out. Naturally, the top felt piece needs a hole so you can see the photo, so usually I hold the top loader up to the light and mark where I can cut, or just eyeball it if I'm feeling bold. After that, I decide to cut out the grass, using the felt I already cut out as a stencil to make sure it fits on the border before gluing it on. Here is where I decide to stitch the edges together, but if you want to just glue it, then go ahead. I kind of like the handmade look that stitching provides, which is why I go this route. I won't be going into the details of sewing like I mentioned earlier, but again, I used a blanket stitch around the edges to keep them in place. And after an awful change in lighting, I can now cut out the clouds and put them on top. I ended up finding some felt that has a sticky backside and is more firm than normal felt, so I ended up using that for the clouds, but you can just easily glue it down. A lot of times I'll just cut and place all of the elements before gluing everything just in case some parts look weird. Here I'm making the tulips by using the darker base as a stencil to make the petals. You can see in the reference that it's lighter pink pieces put onto a darker pink base in order to get that lined look, so I did the same thing. The rest is self-explanatory, cutting out different pieces and putting it all together until it all looks good. I had some frilled ribbon lying around, so I ended up adding that element too, but after gluing everything, it's done. Felt is a super easy medium to work with, so it's incredibly easy making stuff with it. Here's some other felt photo cards I've done so you can see how easy it is and all the different types of things you can try out. That's going to be the easiest craft I'm going to be covering in this video, so if you're down for more of a challenge, let's get into our next activity. This isn't my first time making a figure of my OC. I did one a couple years ago out of clay, and while I still like how it looks, I wanted to try getting into 3D printing for a cleaner look. This can be an intimidating task though, so I'll try to make it as simple as possible. And no, you don't need to own a 3D printer, I'll explain that later. For this project, I ended up learning how to 3D model on Nomad Sculpt in about 2 days, so even though modeling can sound intimidating, it's actually deceptively simple. I won't be fully going over how to use Nomad, but I'll try and explain some basics to help you if you'd like to learn. And I'll also show some creators that inspired me and that I learned from throughout the process, so definitely go check them out. Dave Reed was especially helpful, so I would definitely look at his tutorials if you're getting started. But if you're still nervous about 3D modeling or printing, you can use clay as a substitute. The prepping and painting process will be the same, so you can easily follow the rest of this tutorial if you use clay. I just used polymer clay when I made mine, making sure to build armatures from foil and wire so you aren't using too much of your clay. Either way, for this craft you'll need some paint. I just used some acrylic paint I had lying around, but I know modeling paint exists, but acrylic will work just fine and is pretty cheap and accessible. I also ended up getting some spray primer, which puts on a white base coat to make it easier to paint on top of. This isn't necessary though, and you can just use some white paint to achieve the same effect. I also ended up getting some matte varnish and some gloss varnish to make sure the paint wouldn't chip off. You can use one or the other or none at all, but I wanted the body to be matte and then the cherry to be shiny, so I decided to use those. But I read in line from other figure makers that you don't necessarily need varnish if you're not handling it a lot. You'll also need some sandpaper to smooth things down, both if you're 3D modeling and if you're using clay. Trust me, I wish I sanded down my clay figure more before painting. I ended up using a sanding block as well as a few paper sheets of varying harshness. If you only get one, I just recommend the paper sheets since it makes it easier to get into small cracks. I'd also just recommend getting some gloves and masks for sanding and if you got any spray paint for that as well. As I mentioned earlier, having a 3D printer isn't necessary for this craft. Earlier, when I was working on a Spider Noir cosplay, I ended up finding out that my local library allows you to 3D print for free. Now, their 3D printer was filament instead of resin, and as far as I know, resin usually has a smoother and more detailed look, but I was still able to achieve some good results using their filament printer. So definitely look into libraries around you and see if they offer services like this. But with all the materials out of the way, let's get into the process, starting with 3D modeling. I'm awful at making chibis, so I ended up using a drawing my girlfriend made of our OCs as a reference for what I wanted to make. This actually ended up being the perfect figure to make as a starter since the bodies were super simple to make, and the cherry hats meant I could basically use a big circle for the head. Honestly, Nomad was pretty easy to learn. You just need to figure out the basic controls and use super simple shapes. All the body parts and limbs were just spheres that I used the move and drag tool on to make into the shapes that I needed. Things like the hair and face were also pretty easy since I could just use tubes for the hair strands and draw on certain accessories and parts of the face with the mask tool before extruding. I basically only needed to know how to use the move/drag tool, the mask tool, and how to add primitives and work the symmetry tool. I also used the layer tool to make the indent for the hood and the flatten tool to clean up some edges, but otherwise it was mainly those few tools. I've been learning 3D modeling in both Nomad and Blender, and both are extremely useful tools for projects like this and modeling props and environments, so even if you aren't looking to 3D print anything, I'd highly recommend watching some tutorials and giving it a go. I had to think of this model like an actual toy, so I ended up making the head, body, and stem separate. Using the Boolean cut feature, I was able to cut shapes out of other shapes in order to make some holes for the head to fit on the body and the stem to fit into the hats. But if I did this again, I'd probably make the holes wider or the pegs smaller, since it was a bit difficult to get them to fit when they were 3D printed. I'll show the video I used on screen to figure out how to get these ready to print, but essentially I had to reduce the complexity of the mesh and simplify things so the file wasn't too big. After exporting the body parts separately, I was able to bring them into Lychee Slicer and arrange them for print. Some of my models had some issues, but luckily Lychee Slicer will fix it for you. It's usually recommended to tilt body parts 45 degrees, so I ended up doing that for the head and lying the body flat. I also lifted them off the tray since underneath would be where the supports go. I did mess around with making the supports a bit, but I found that my library would do that for me, so I was able to just export the STL files and upload them to my library's website directly. Since there was a time limit for printing at my library, I split these into 2 different jobs, so I'll be just painting my character Kitty for this video. I had to wait about a week, but soon I was notified that I could pick up my figure and see how it turned out. And here he is! I was surprised he turned out so well considering I didn't really know what I was doing, but everything seemed like how I made it. After taking the supports off, now I just had to sand everything and get it ready for painting. At first I ended up going over everything with a sanding block, but eventually switched to the paper in order to get into the small cracks. There was a ring around the head and a small hole in the cherry, so I ended up having to use some rough pieces to get it all smoothed out. You can't really see it in the video, but I was able to run my hand along the different parts and see what was smooth and what needed more sanding. Again, the pegs were a bit too big for the holes, so I ended up just sanding the pegs down because I don't own any drills or similar things that would work. After I felt like I had sanded well enough, I went in and sprayed the pieces down with the first coat of primer. Make sure you do this in a well-ventilated area with a mask if you also use a spray like this. But anyways, after my first spray, I could see some parts that still needed sanding, so I went back in and sanded some more. And here you can see the parts of the paint that were worn away by the other round of sanding. You really want to make sure you sand thoroughly whether you're 3D printing or using clay, since proper sanding will make your figure look way more smooth and professional. I went in and sprayed it down about 2 more times with primer, making sure everything was evenly coated and looked good before it was ready to paint. You really want to have patience and wait for things to completely dry, as moving on to more coats when it's still wet can cause some issues. But now that everything was smooth and primed, I could finally get to painting. I decided to work from lightest to darkest color, that way I could be messier with my lighter colors and cover them later with darker ones. I also diluted my acrylic paint with some water, getting rid of the streakiness that can occur when you use thicker paint. Again, you really want to be patient and let each coat fully dry before moving on to the next. If it doesn't dry, you can end up lifting the previous layer and getting nowhere. The first coat always looks bad, so after a couple layers I was able to get everything looking pretty smooth. For some of the smaller details like the eyes, I ended up using paint markers because they gave me better control over everything. Originally, I was gonna paint on mouths as well, but I ended up leaving them out because I kinda like the Hello Kitty look of it, although I guess it could kinda look like I have no mouth but I'm a screen, so. My matte varnish ended up looking kinda shiny because I didn't shake it enough and probably put it on too thick, but it didn't turn out that bad at the end. I sprayed it similarly to how I did the primer, except I only really used 1 coat this time. I also went in with another coat of gloss after everything dried, using it on the cherry to make it extra shiny and resemble a fruit. But with that, the figure is done. There's still some spots where the paint came off that I might have to go over later, and some areas I wish I made a little smoother. I don't paint often, so I'm not exactly the most skilled with it, but I'm still happy with how things turned out. Being able to model my own figure and have it printed out is just amazing in and of itself, and makes me way more proud of the final product. I didn't paint the stem because I wanted to sand it and make sure it fit with the other half of the figure. My girlfriend's character only finished printing yesterday by the time I'm writing this script, so if I end up finishing it by the time this video goes up, I'll put the final product on screen now. But with that, this ends this section for 3D modeling and figure making, so let's transition into our final and beefiest craft of the video. If you follow my other social media, you might already know that I've been diving into plush making as of late. I've gotten some commissions before, but considering how expensive they are and how dodgy some of these businesses can be, I decided to learn it myself. Not only is it more rewarding to have your own plush made by you, but you can make it exactly how you want it. For example, a lot of these places use this faux fur type material for the hair, but I really like the stylized anime-esque look much better. So while sewing might be intimidating, it's actually pretty simple when you get the basics down. The pattern for this tutorial that I'll be using is by DaiWooQ on Twitter, and it's much simpler than a larger plush. This is a 10cm plush as opposed to the larger 20cm plush you may often see, so it's a great place to start if you've just started sewing. It also takes up less material, so there's more room for error if you mess up. If you're still feeling intimidated, you can also make felt plush as an alternative. I'll show some videos on screen if you want to go visit those channels for more details, but usually felt plush are more simple and flat, requiring less sewing and good for beginners. With felt being more accessible as well, I'd recommend it to anyone aiming for something simpler. But with that, let's dive into materials. Naturally, you'll need some basic sewing supplies. I have a sewing machine, so I'll be using that throughout the video, but you can easily hand sew everything just fine. I hand sew some parts while making plush because it's just easier, and I found that using the back stitch method is recommended because it holds better. So obviously you'll need a needle and thread. I have a bunch of colored Gutermann thread I use to color match to the fabric, but you can easily get by with just white and black thread. You won't really be seeing the stitches anyways. If you don't want to get actual thread, you can also use embroidery floss, which will be necessary for embroidering. I think it is more flimsy and has a higher chance of breaking, but you still can use it. The main reason I have a lot of colored thread is because I use an embroidery machine to make the faces of my plushies, but if you're just starting out, you'll need to hand embroider the faces. I hand embroidered my first plushies and they turned out pretty good, so it shouldn't be too steep of a learning curve. I'm no expert though, so I included some videos on hand embroidering plush faces in the playlist in the description. But for hand embroidery, things like an embroidery hoop to hold the fabric in place is recommended. Another thing I use that isn't required but recommended is water-soluble transfer paper. You can print designs onto this paper and then stick it to your fabric. Then, after you embroider your design using the paper as an outline, you can just run it underwater and the paper will dissolve. This method helped me a ton when I used to hand embroider faces, so I definitely recommend giving it a go. But of course, there's other methods of transfer, so it's not necessary. And if hand embroidery seems intimidating to you, you can just make felt faces. I have videos from Mimi Bit's Cool Crafts in the playlist below, but they do a lot of felt faces and have tutorials regarding that. Now, as far as fabric goes, I use Minky. Microfleece can also work as an alternative, but Minky is the most widely used because of how soft and easy to work with it is. You can find these in some craft stores, but I get mine online. I've gotten a lot off Etsy personally, but you'll just need fabric for the skin and hair. And for stuffing, I just use polyfill stuffing you can get for pretty cheap at any craft store. The other thing you'll need is fabric scissors, which is pretty self-explanatory. But some other things you might want but aren't completely necessary are things like fabric markers for marking patterns, seam rippers if you make a mistake, pins to hold fabric in place, and glue. I use washable fabric glue to hold things in place sometimes, but you can also use hot glue to attach certain pieces like hair if you want. And last but not least, you need to print out the pattern. I have it linked below for you to print and cut out. Well, with all that out the way, now we can finally get onto the process. First, let's do the easy part and start with the body. Since the body is only 3 parts, it's pretty simple. First, you need to mark and cut out the 3 gingerbread-shaped pieces from the pattern. One thing to know about this is that the pattern doesn't account for seam allowance, meaning you'll have to account for that yourself when cutting. In case you don't know what seam allowance is, you can see here that the fabric is slightly bigger than the pattern itself. This line is where I'm going to sew, but the fabric outside of that is the seam allowance. Seam allowance basically just gives you room to sew, since it would be extremely hard to sew on the edge of fabric effectively. But anyways, to make the body, you're just going to be sewing the 2 half parts onto the full body like so. You want to make sure that the bad parts are facing out when sewing these together, meaning you can see your markings on both sides. We'll be flipping it inside out later, which is why you want to do this. There's a small line in the sewing pattern on the parts of the body, and I'd sew until that point when putting it together. You want to leave some room on the neck to allow you to flip the fabric inside out and add stuffing. But after sewing both sides of the body to the main piece, you can sew these 2 sides together to form the back. And just like that, you have the body. Now you can flip it and fill it with stuffing. Just make sure to kind of prod at the limbs to fully stuff them with stuffing. If your body looks kind of blob-like, you can define the limbs by going in and stitching further inward on the arms and legs, but I kind of like the starfish look they have going on. But with the body done, now we have to get to the hard part, the head. The main reason the head can get tricky is the face. I mentioned it in the materials section, but you'll likely be hand embroidering the face. I left some videos in the playlist below for you to look at when seeing how to do the face using embroidery, but I won't really be covering that in this video since I'm not that skilled at it and I use my embroidery machine. And of course, you can just use felt to make the face if you want, which would be a lot easier. I draw my faces digitally and digitize them using embroidery software. This just tells my machine what to do. I won't go too in depth about the process since it's unlikely many of you will have an embroidery machine on hand, but I end up having to do the hair on top and cut it out in between that and the face. And after that, I usually just touch up the face if needed using my embroidery hoop. According to the creator of the pattern, the face area is 6.1 by 6.1 centimeters. I'll also show a visual of where the face should be placed relative to the pattern on screen, which I used when making these. So you can see kind of where to place the face. I kind of wish I made the eyes bigger than my last plush, but you end up figuring this stuff out with trial and error, and I couldn't really redo this because this was my last of my light brown fabric. Anyways, after that, you can draw the pattern onto the back of the face according to the photo I showed. I usually draw horizontal and vertical lines to help me figure out where to place the pattern and make sure it's centered. After that, I can cut it out. Since I end up sewing the hair onto the fabric of the skin, I usually end up cutting off the excess skin and redrawing the pattern on the hair. Now that the face is cut out, you can cut out the different parts for the hair and chin. As for the ears, let's just do them now. Instead of cutting out those super tiny ears and trying to deal with sewing it like that, I usually just take some scrap fabric and fold it in half, making sure the bad sides are showing. Then I can just draw on the ears and sew it like that. Because of how small these ears are, it's just easier to do it like this and then cut them out afterwards. I forgot to mention this in my original recording, but you don't want to sew the straight part of the ears because you'll need to flip these inside out also. So don't sew that part, just sew the curve and flip them inside out when you're done. Next, I decide to prepare the head and hair. You can see in this pattern there's these triangle cutouts. What we'll be doing is sewing these together in order to make the head and hair more circular. Just press the good sides of the fabric together and sew along the lines. Afterwards, it should look something like this. But now that that's done, we can put it all together. First, you want to sew the ears onto the body. I ended up doing the chin first accidentally, so don't be like me and make sure to get the ears on first. You want to sew the ears on the side of the face, facing the opposite way, so the rounded edge should be facing the inside. Again, this is because it'll be flipped inside out later. Usually at this point I add a crease in the ears with a simple stitch when attaching them, but you can just leave them as is or do that earlier. The first time I made a plush, I sewed it on the wrong side, so you want to make sure you're sewing it on the side with the face like so. Make sure the seam is clean because if it's lumpy, then it'll be super noticeable. Now with that done, you can sew on the back pieces of the head. It's kind of a similar process to the body where you sew the two halves on the side of the whole head piece and then sew them together. The reason you're probably seeing some footage from another plush on screen is because I ended up using a slightly different and more complicated version. This is because previously I used to make long-haired characters by just sewing extra fabric to the back of the head. I still like this method, but I wanted to try making the hair seamless like I've seen other plush makers do. But for your first plush, I just used the first method of sewing the hair on the head. Just make sure the sides with the triangles you sewed earlier are facing on the outside, whereas the smooth, curved side faces the inside. You'll have finished the head by that point, so if you want to just skip ahead to the timestamp on screen, then go ahead. I'll be covering a more complex version of making the hair, but later on I'll show another version that is better for beginners. If you want a more comprehensive tutorial, since this was my first time attempting this, I'll show the video I used on screen, which is also included in the playlist below. But essentially what I had to do was combine the two headpiece patterns into one. I did what was shown in the video, drawing a straight line and then folding it in order to make a symmetrical pattern when cut. Then I just draw on the hair. After this, you can cut it out and use it as a pattern. Since the pattern I'm using was different from the video, I was a bit unsure about making the triangle as large as it is in the merged pattern. You can see it's pretty big. However, this is correct and you want to sew it together similar to the other triangles you had to do for the face and other hair parts, so pressing it together and then sewing. But after sewing those triangles together, I had to cut out another hair piece and sew it to the bottom of the larger one. It's probably best demonstrated visually, but sewing it like this allowed me to flip the bottom piece inside out. The reason you have to do this is because you'll be sewing this large hairpiece onto the other hairpiece from earlier. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. I kind of struggle with explaining it, but you can see that the actual headpiece is sewed onto the face while the hair is separate. I also sewed some hair pieces similar to how I did the ears, drawing patterns on scrap fabric and then sewing it like that. You can also attach it to the hair similar to the ears where it faces the wrong way, so when it's flipped inside out, it'll be the right way and look like hair. But with that, let me resume where I left off now that the head is complete. After the whole head is done, you can flip it inside out and start filling it with stuffing. Definitely make sure to tug on some pieces and check to see if there's any holes. Sometimes you might need to turn it inside out again and fix spots you missed or that came apart. When filling, I kind of squeeze the head and make sure the stuffing is distributed through the cheeks and such, moving it around to my liking. And after that, it's a matter of putting the head and body together. I use the ladder stitch method to attach it, making sure to pull on my string often so it all comes together. Sometimes the plush might be a bit lopsided or the head is too far away from the body, so I just go back and ladder stitch some more, closer to the chin. Now, here is where you could stop, but I wanted to cover another method for making hair that I used to use and is much easier than what I showed earlier. I used to use this method of making hair, which I will have linked in the description. It's much more clear than any way I could explain it, so I'd give it a watch. Essentially, I make patterns for the hair out of paper towels and use those as my patterns. You can take these patterns and use them how I showed earlier in the video, where you use the method similar to how you made the ears. So taking a scrap piece of paper, folding it, and then sewing it like that. However, sometimes when you turn it inside out, it doesn't retain the sharpness of the pattern because of how small it is and can be tricky to work with, so what I used to do was just sew two pieces together right side out and use that. Just go with whatever method you want. I also used felt at some point, so just do what you think fits your skill level and personal preference the best. But once you make those pieces, you can just ladder stitch them to the side of the head, and also to the back of the head if you want. I've also seen people use hot glue here, which you can definitely do, but I just sew it myself since it feels better and I assume it has less of a chance of falling off. This character has his roots showing, so I just made a smaller hair piece out of felt and attach it to the head using glue. I ended up sewing it to the head, but you could also just hot glue it if you wish. And with that, the plush is finally done. As I'm writing this script, I can tell this will be long, but I try to keep things thorough while also concise. I won't be going over making clothes since this video is already long enough, but maybe I'll make another video on OC plush where I can just talk about that. This plush's face is a bit off center, but that was just an issue with the stuffing, and I ended up fixing it after I took this video. Even then, I had a few issues with this plush because I was trying out a new method, so there's some mistakes I want to fix going forward. My first ever plush was extremely ugly, but I was quickly able to learn from my mistakes and correct them. So even if your first plush doesn't turn out right, don't be too hard on yourself. I didn't even mention all the weird scrap abominations I made before I finished my first actual plush. But now that that section's finally over, let's move on to the conclusion. Finally, after this monster of a video, we can be done. This has probably been the hardest video I've worked on, considering I needed to learn a bunch of new skills and figure out how to record everything on my phone that lacks any storage whatsoever. Honestly, I'd be lying if I said I was a master at any of these. I'm probably mediocre compared to all the sewers and 3D modelers out there. However, the joy of crafts isn't mastery, but just being able to make something with your own two hands and learn new skills. I ended up choosing this video topic to showcase my sponsor Craftsian because I truly believe that more artists should try out different creative mediums. Ever since I've picked up these hobbies, I can recharge and take breaks from drawing while still feeding my creativity. So hopefully this video inspired you to try picking up a new hobby and try out new things. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love if you could subscribe or even share this to people who might be interested. I worked really hard on all these crafts and I'm super passionate about sharing knowledge both at drawing and other creative mediums, so any support means the world to me. But with that, thank you so much for watching and thanks for sticking until the end. Bye!